When it comes to the war in Ukraine, one of the objectives that a lot of people simply don't believe is actually achievable is for Ukraine to recapture Crimea from Russian hands. And when you look at the reasons that people believe this, on the surface, they at first seem to be correct. If you're not familiar with Crimea, Crimea is a peninsula that juts out from Ukraine into the Black Sea. And owing to its geography, it is probably the single most difficult piece of Ukrainian territory to assault, and therefore the single most costly piece of territory for Ukraine to try to take back from Russian control. Crimea in particular, though it is a large peninsula, can really only be accessed by land via a very narrow choke point, making it very easy to fortify and meaning that any assault on Crimea would have to result in a lot of casualties, both hitting this majorly defended fortification and also probably consisting of beach landings in order to try to get behind those positions. Because of the difficulties in recapturing this peninsula, and because a lot of military analysts have estimated extremely high casualties if Ukraine were to try to do so, a lot of people have simply written this target off as impossible. So much so, in fact, that a lot of politicians, when they are trying to set up peace terms between Ukraine and Russia, will often try to force Ukraine to simply concede control of Crimea to Russia permanently. But this is something that Ukraine in particular has always refused to do, always claiming that they can retake Crimea eventually, and that others are simply not thinking carefully enough about the strategic situation, and also simply about the importance of taking back Crimea as a strategic target. Something that is absolutely worth taking back, even if it results in high casualties. So what I want to analyze in this video is who is actually correct about this and who is actually stubborn about this. Is it actually possible for Ukraine to recapture Crimea at a cost that makes sense without sacrificing needless human lives? Or is the recapture of Crimea simply a pipe dream by people who are hopeful but who have their head in the clouds and aren't grounded in reality? What I will say here at the forefront is very important. Where a lot of politicians have come in and said the recapture of Crimea is impossible, without actually looking carefully at the strategic situation Ukraine is in and what type of war Ukraine is actually fighting against Russia. And when politicians come in and say that it is impossible for Ukraine to ever recapture Crimea, this is not so much a reflection of Ukraine's military capabilities, but rather a reflection of these politicians' lack of imagination and lack of long-term strategic thinking, both of which Ukraine has shown they have in droves when it comes to this war against Russia, which they have used to consistently, on a very regular basis, defy expectations and surprise Western analysts who thought they would be toppled very quickly and have consistently been proved to be wrong. With that in mind, the most important thing when it comes to analyzing the actual strategic situation of Crimea is not to look at the situation in Crimea as it exists today, but instead to look at how that situation might be changed over time and what is actually being done to change that strategic situation over time. And what I'm going to posit and defend in this video is that if Ukraine tried to attack Crimea today, the objective would probably be impossible to achieve. But the war in Ukraine is not going to end today. There are certain conditions that will have to happen for the war in Ukraine to end. And when those conditions are met, it will not only be possible for Ukraine to retake Crimea, but it actually might even be relatively easy and potentially even bloodless. So first, it's important to baseline on Crimea's strategic significance in general and how that has already completely changed over the course of the war. Because when you realize how much it has already changed, you realize how much more room there is for things to still change. Crimea at the start of the war, and really for a long time, has been seen as one of the most strategic pieces of Ukrainian territory in general. And there is a reason that Crimea was the first piece of Ukrainian territory that Russia ever conquered all the way back in 2014. And that's because Crimea juts out into the Black Sea and is quite easy to defend. On Crimea, which is easy to defend from land invasions, there exists one of the most important ports in the entire Black Sea. One of the only warm water, deep water ports that is actually large enough to host an entire navy. And when you look at where Crimea is situated in the Black Sea, this positioning is also ideal in terms of being centralized for navies to carry out patrols and other types of operations. And because of these facts, Crimea has long been seen as the key to naval access to the Black Sea, and therefore the key to trade route access to and through the Black Sea as well. And for Russia in particular, this port is also important because it is one of the few ports they have access to that is ice-free all year long. Given these facts, a lot of people concluded that whoever controlled Crimea could ultimately control Ukraine, because they could control the comings and goings of merchant vessels bringing food and other supplies both to and from Ukrainian territory, giving a large degree of control and exertion over the Ukrainian economy. And because of this, Crimea was a major focus in the early days of the war. And due to that early focus, the strategic position and the strategic understanding of Crimea has already completely changed. And it's actually completely flipped. So now Crimea is not seen as the key to unlocking access to Ukraine, but rather controlling the rest of Ukraine is now seen as the key to unlocking access to Crimea. Early on in the war, Ukraine essentially eliminated the Russian Black Sea fleet that was stationed in Crimea, to the point that most of that fleet, if not all of that fleet, had to reposition and relocate much further away from Ukrainian territory, despite the fact that Ukraine itself did not even have a navy. Ukraine was essentially able to defeat this incredibly strategic naval position by using naval drones, by using long-range missiles and other things of the sort, making it almost impossible for the Russian Black Sea fleet to actually even operate, and effectively eliminating much of the strategic importance of Crimea in general. Now, rather than Crimea being able to control what goes on in the waters around it, it turns out that what goes on in the waters around Crimea controls it. Ukraine has been able to unlock passageways to allow continued trade of its vessels through the Black Sea, largely uninterrupted at this point. And we see the position of Crimea now completely flipped. The main thing that makes Crimea easy to defend, which is the fact that it is a peninsula that is only accessed through a narrow access point, also now makes Crimea an extremely vulnerable peninsula. Because the only way to get most of the water onto the Crimean Peninsula is actually through canals that have to pass through that same narrow choke point. These canals are obviously quite easy to block and dam and basically remove the source of water going onto the Crimean Peninsula. There are a couple of other ways to supply Crimea, but not many. It can be supplied via the water, but we've already seen that if Ukraine wants to, they can control what goes on in the waters around Crimea. And it can also be supplied by something called the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the only land bridge on the eastern part of the peninsula that connects it to the rest of Russian territory, where there's a road and a railway that continue right now at this current moment to supply Crimea and give them critical access to things like fuel, food, and water, and also anything else they could want or need. If you haven't figured it out yet, Crimea is extremely vulnerable to siege. And in particular, it's vulnerable to siege by an opponent that is patient and willing to take as much time as necessary to achieve its goals. The same aspects that make Crimea easy to fortify and therefore easy to keep Ukrainian soldiers out can also be used against Crimea to keep Russian soldiers in, or Russian people in general, and to prevent aid and supplies from getting to them. That is the real strategic way that people should look at Crimea in the long term and whether or not it could ultimately be taken. Not by the dynamics of how costly an invasion of Crimea would be, but rather by the dynamics of how vulnerable it would be to siege and how easy it would be for an opponent to actually achieve that objective. Historically, of course, this idea is well trodden. Many of the world's most powerful empires, most powerful cities, ultimately succumbed to siege. Siege is one of the most tried and true historical tactics when it comes to war, and it's the tactic that, for a lot of people, is the easiest to understand and the easiest to execute against. So when we look at Crimea, what we realize is that at a time of Ukraine's choosing, when they are ready to take Crimea back, they can probably cut off access to Crimea from every access point. They can destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge, they can lock off land access to Crimea, and they can prevent people getting to or from it via the sea, as they've already done to the Black Sea Navy. So the question you then have to ask is, will Ukraine ever get to a point where it will be in a strategic position to do all of those things I've just listed? The answer to that question is, of course they could be. When you understand the war in Ukraine for what it is, and not what people think it is who are incorrect. Where the war in Ukraine is a war of attrition. Where Ukraine's entire strategy is to lock into defensive positions, hold for as long as they have to, and exert more casualties against the Russian military until ultimately Russia runs out of men or runs out of resources to send against them, and there's a potential break in the Russian economy, a potential break in Russian leadership, or a break in the Russian military's ability to continue fighting. I've mentioned this in past videos, but I'll mention it again. It's very similar historically to World War I, where the battle lines didn't change much until they did, until Germany's economy broke down due to economic reasons, due to blockades of the same type that we're talking about when it comes to Crimea, and Germany was ultimately forced to negotiate peace terms. When it comes to Ukraine's war against Russia, if and when they're able to achieve something similar against Russia, that is when the battle for Crimea would actually take place, not before. And so you have to look at Crimea as it will exist, not today, but how it would look after Russia's economy had broken down, after Russia's military had broken down, and potentially Russian soldiers no longer want to fight for Russia. This makes Crimea's fortified position look a whole lot weaker. Ukraine is, of course, not going to attack Crimea today for multiple reasons. First of all, that's just not Ukraine's style, that's Russia's style. Russia's style is to send tons of men and resources against heavily fortified positions and to break themselves against those positions, and Ukraine's style is to hold against them. There's also the fact that when we look at Crimea, we've already discussed that at this point in the war, it's not really strategically important. There is no longer a navy operating out of Crimea that is having any major impact on the battlefield. Ukraine has shown that they can hit any target on Crimea with abandon, and they can basically control what happens on the peninsula, even if they can't control the peninsula themselves. And so Ukraine will wait as long as they have to until Crimea becomes a more tenable target. And it could become a more tenable target simply due to siege, or simply due to Russia negotiating into the war, where they were actually forced to give Crimea back to Ukraine, because Ukraine might just simply be able to put it under siege, and the Crimean people are not going to want to be part of that. On top of all of this, there is another factor that I haven't even mentioned yet, which is that Ukraine's strategy as a military is focusing increasingly more and more on drones. And Ukraine is producing a huge surplus of these drones, with millions of them being produced by Ukraine itself every single year. And that number is only increasing more and more and more and more, especially now with Europe and now even the United States looking to invest in helping Ukraine grow its drone production capacity. And not only is its capacity for large numbers of drones increasing, but the technology on those drones is increasing as well, and they're becoming more and more capable. Ukraine already eliminated the strategic importance of Crimea, the Black Sea Fleet, using drones. They've come a long way since then. So it's not inconceivable at all that Ukraine at some point in the very near future, when they are ready, could absolutely overwhelm the infantry defenses on Crimea as well. And they could use that without having to have a huge costly assault on this fortified position. That is another option as well that could be used instead of or in combination with all the other strategies I've already discussed. So the important thing to note here is that Ukraine has options. And not only can they actually take Crimea, but there's multiple ways that they could actually achieve that. And it does not have to be a heavily costly objective. So when you have politicians trying to pressure Ukraine into just submitting to Russia, when Ukraine is actually making heavy strides in the areas where they could actually achieve their objectives over the long term. And Ukraine is saying, well, we don't want to give up Crimea because we think we can actually take it back. Well, given all of these things we talked about today, now I hope you can realize who you should actually listen to. This is why it's so important to actually think critically about every single aspect of this war. You do not just accept the first narrative you hear that seems to make sense at face value. Because nothing in this war is to be taken at face value. I make these videos to help bring out those important facts that often sit below the surface. And if you want to support more of that, you can do so by becoming a patron of this channel. I'm super thankful for all of my patrons. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with someone who might be losing hope. Ukraine can actually win. There's good reasons to believe that. And I believe they probably will. See you on the next video.